Welcome to In Conversation. I'm your host, Steve Iverson. Today our guest is State Senator Cindy Friedman, who is our state senator for most of Lexington, along with Senator Barrett, who is a senator for the other part of town. We're very pleased that she was able to come in today and talk about what she does and what she's been working on. So thank you for coming in.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Good. I know you've got a bit of a cold, so we'll do the best we can. To start with the basics, let me ask you, what does the state senator actually do?
The state senator does a couple things. Represents the district in the Massachusetts Senate. Does constituent services for residents of in my case, the 4th Middlesex. We do policy. We write a lot of legislation. We pass some of it. It's, I think, pretty much a job that people would recognize as what a senator does.
Gotcha. Okay. No surprises there.
No.
And you became senator after a special election last summer.
Yes.
The previous senator, Senator Donnelly, passed away.
Yes.
And you were his chief of staff.
Yep.
Worked very closely with
That's
him.
right.
I was doing some reading today, and somebody somewhere called you more of a team than anything, the two of you. Is that true?
Senator Donnelly and I were very, very close friends, and we worked very closely together, and it did feel like a partnership to me. He's somebody that I loved and admired, and just it was such a pleasure and joy and honor for me to be working with him. But it did feel like a partnership. We were really, we knew what each brought, and he was really, he wanted a partnership. He didn't want to, he wanted that connection, and he likes to work in a team. He believes in teams. He believes in groups. He believed in, together we can do good things.
So what pieces did you have to pick up that he had previously carried when you took his seat? You said that you had some things you concentrated on, and he had some things that he concentrated on.
Well, there were two pieces. One is he filed the $15 an hour minimum wage bill, and so I picked that up for him in the past session, and so that was a big one. Another one was that we had done a lot of work on bail reform, and that is something that came, that we addressed when I became senator. So we carried that through. And then a lot of the mental health and substance use disorder bills that were one of the things that I brought to the table. I continued that work as well.
Okay. So you have a special interest in mental health and substance abuse?
Yes. In fact, I am the Senate chair of that committee. So.
Okay. And what kinds of things, what kinds of things specifically do you work on in that area from day to day to try to get things passed? Or
So all the bills that are filed that have to do with mental health or substance use disorder come to our committee.
Okay.
So we look at all those bills, we vet them, we hold hearings, and then we make a determination about whether it's a bill that we will endorse so that it will move on in the process, or whether it's a bill that we feel either we're not ready for or doesn't quite hold muster in some way. Then we will we vote to not have those move out of committee. Okay. So there's that piece of it, and then there's the individual pieces where I've been doing a lot of work on criminal justice and mental illness, And so I had pieces that I was working on, one of them being a restoration center that pilot program, which will bring all the stakeholders together in Middlesex County, which is where we live, to look at a way to divert people from the criminal justice system, even pre-adjudication. So before there's any kind of interaction with a cell or a court, we would have a means for taking somebody who was in the middle of a psychotic episode or a substance use issue. We would divert them to treatment versus into the court system.
I see.
Or into an emergency room. But we would, so that's something that we worked on, and I got some money put into the budget, and so now we're starting the process of defining and implementing a restoration center in Middlesex County. So that's something that I do, which is kind of separate from the being the chair of the committee, but is related to mental health.
Okay. So if someone breaks the law, does something they shouldn't do, and it quickly becomes clear that there's a mental health issue central to it, this is a attempt to steer the person towards treatment rather than arrest and
it's
so
actually even before that. So often when people are in the middle of maybe a psychotic episode, there's no place for them to go.
Right.
And people call the police and they say, help me, my son is having an episode, he's very disoriented, he's hearing voices, and the police come, and we've been doing a lot of work around training our police to handle to de-escalate these situations. But then once they say this kid needs help, what do they do? Where do they take them? And they have two choices: to an emergency room, or because they think he's going to hurt himself, maybe they put him in a cell, or he gets agitated and he pushes a policeman. He doesn't even, he pushes somebody, and they say, well, okay, I either got to take you to an emergency room, or those are my choices, or a jail cell.
Right.
Well, those are not the answer. That person has not done anything criminal. They just need help. And so and that happens all the time in our system. And so if you can take those people, and if you take that person to a place where they can get immediately evaluated and some outcome can happen that will help them to get stabilized, that's a much better solution than an emergency room or a jail cell.
Right. And it's better than an emergency room because it's a specific set of skills there and perhaps outcomes?
Yeah, yes, and an emergency room is not adept or able to handle somebody who's having, they will review them, they will look at them, they will say, okay, are you a harm to yourself or others? And if you're not, they're not equipped to provide services.
Right.
And in terms of substance use, we've made some good headway in that area, where when somebody comes in and they're clearly somebody who's on a substance or having they're overdosing, we now by law require an emergency room to offer that person medication for their substance use, and then get them, if they accept it and want to, get them to treatment. But that's brand new. We just started that. So again, if somebody's having an issue with an overdose or with drugs, you want to get them to treatment. You don't want to get them into a jail cell. That doesn't solve the problem.
Sure. I believe the police chief in Arlington has been progressive with especially opioid addiction issues.
Yes.
Trying to make sure that people get treatment if at all possible, and an approach that I believe was pioneered at one time by the chief of police in Gloucester, Massachusetts.
Actually, the program in Gloucester was come here, give us your drugs. We're not going to arrest you.
Right.
We'll get you treatment.
Right.
What Arlington is doing is a much more sort of intensive, helping people who they know might be using drugs, have come in, they've taken them to the hospital, they've come out again, and so they do follow-up, they try and engage them in treatment. They also have, they're part of the towns that have a social worker that rides in cars with police to help de-escalate, help to figure out, what's going on with this person. So they're very much involved in this form of treatment, they're in treatment, and saying, okay, this is not a crime right here. This is a person who needs help or who is sick. And, we're a nation and a state which is making this transition from substance use disorder as a crime. No, it's an illness. No, it's a crime. No, it's an illness. So sometimes we treat it like a crime, and sometimes we treat it like an illness. And what we're trying to do is move that pendulum so that it is treated like an illness, because addiction is an illness.
Right.
And so what it needs is a medical and a health care response, not a criminal response.
And overall, what do you think of Massachusetts' overall care and services for the mentally ill? It's been my impression that it's not good enough. But tell me what you think. You know more than I do.
I think it's woefully inadequate.
It is.
And I think that the fact that we have parity laws on the books does not seem to be working. I think that there are so many problems with the delivery of behavioral health and substance use recovery programs. And I think we're just really starting to address it, to look at it. I mean, there's so much stigma and so much judgment around mental illness and substance use disorder. And so I think that's part of why we have such a woefully inadequate system. I also believe that insurance companies are a big part of the access problems.
And even with parity being on the books officially, I think what happens perhaps more and more is that the providers, independent providers, once they're established in their career, are more likely now to start just charging an out-of-pocket fee, because they feel as though what insurance companies pay them is not enough. They can't make a living that way, so they stop accepting insurance. Certainly not all of them, but I understand that that's a widening trend, which makes it harder for many people to get services.
Yeah, it's a big problem in the field. It's not only that the rates are so low, and that's a big problem. It's also how insurance companies deal with their providers, their network. There's a lot of instances where an insurance company will pay for a service, and then they'll come back 6 months later and say, oh, we made a mistake, or wait, that person has other insurance, give us back our money.
Boy.
Nowhere does that happen. And
I bet that doesn't happen to cardiac surgeons.
Oh, I bet you're right. I bet you're right. And so it's called clawbacks. So there's a whole issue of clawbacks. In addition to that, providers don't get paid for any time other than direct contact with the client. And so it makes it virtually impossible for them to do follow-up, to talk to other people to get a sense of what's going on, to spend any time that is going to help the patient outside of whatever the direct contact is. And that's a huge problem, because mental health does not live in a vacuum.
Right.
And that's part of the job, is to be able to, especially with children, I mean, it's a major component of dealing with children. And we have such a shortage of child mental health providers that it's a crisis. I mean, people will spend months and months literally looking for help for a child.
Even around here, which is one of the most
Even around here.
one of the areas of the country where there's a very high concentration of providers.
Sure.
Overall.
Right, overall,
Yeah.
but less and less, as you said, of those providers are taking insurance because it's just not worth it. The aggravation isn't worth it, and the pay isn't worth it. I was talking to a couple social workers who see clients, and they said that once they're done doing all the paperwork, spending all the time to get reimbursement, they were making about $11 an hour. And it just, between the rates that they have and the amount of time that they spend dealing with the insurance companies, it just becomes, it's untenable. They can't earn a living. So more and more people say, I'm not going to take insurance, or you go figure it out with your insurance company.
What do you think a solution for that might be, or solutions?
Well, I think we need to start holding the insurance companies, for starters, accountable. I think we need to hold the Department of Insurance in Massachusetts accountable because they have the authority to enforce parity. I think it's really a question of asking the right questions and getting at the right data, because we have to prove that this is happening, even though we know it's happening everywhere. But I think we have to get really serious about enforcing parity, and we have to have real honest conversations with the insurance companies about what's going on and what the barriers are.
Those are...
I'm trying to be really, like, what's the word? Political or circumspect.
Circumspect.
I'm trying to be circumspect. I tried to not say, are you kidding? This is what we have to do.
That's okay. If you'd like to, please do that. Please say that. It's a really awful problem.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody, I don't know, today, and we were talking about the fact that there is so much money in this healthcare system.
Yeah.
I mean, we have the most expensive healthcare in the most expensive country in the world, right?
Yeah.
And our outcomes are not as good or better than the rest of the world. So you can't tell me that at with trillions of dollars, there isn't money in that system that can be moved or that can be used in a more efficient way.
Yeah.
And that means that we got to focus on primary care and family care much more than we do now, and that we have to address the issues around mental health and substance use disorder. How do you break through the barriers of a system that's so entrenched to get better outcomes?
Yeah. And to use an old-fashioned word, it seems like greed is all mixed up in this.
Yeah, I think it's a question of what are you willing, how much skin are you willing to put in the game to have a better outcome?
Yeah.
And it's hard to get people to move off that,
Yeah.
to kind of move off their position.
Yeah.
Because, we all will have to give something. That's just the way it's going to work. It's, there's no solution where we can provide all of this care and take all these people, and it's not going to cost anything. I mean, that just isn't reality.
Right. It is going to cost something, but we need to have our priorities right.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else is a sort of a big issue for you besides mental health and its treatment?
I think housing is a huge issue in our state. I think there's housing for working families is a huge issue, and housing for people who live in communities like Lexington and Arlington, who have lived there for many, many years and now feel priced out, and in fact probably are priced out.
And their kids and grandchildren can't afford to
and
live in the same
their kids and grandchildren
town.
can't afford to live in the same town, and there's no place for them to go where they can still maintain their sense of community. So housing is a major issue across my district, and I think in the greater Boston area. And I think a big piece of that is also transportation. The ability for people to get back and forth in an efficient way really determines where people live. So we're all growing like crazy. You know, the 4th Middlesex, which is my district, is growing like crazy from Billerica down to Arlington.
Right.
Because it is near the economic hub. And that's where the jobs are. And that's where the traffic is. And the traffic is unbelievable, unbelievably bad. So not only does it raise housing prices, but it also has this huge effect on how people get to and from their jobs and in their community. And we have a woefully inefficient transportation system. And so it's a big, I think it's a huge issue, and we have to start being kind of strong enough and courageous enough to say we have to start putting money into this, and we're not going to see it for a while. But the longer we go, the harder it's going to be. I mean, imagine if we had a decent train out to Springfield, right? You could live in Springfield. We could get to Springfield. We could, we need to open up our state to more opportunities where people can live in very wonderful communities that aren't, where they can afford to live, that they can get back and forth.
Most of central Massachusetts is much less expensive, but
most of central Massachusetts,
quite a drive if you're going into Cambridge or.
It's quite a drive. I mean, it's hours, and it's hours if you want to take public transportation from the Fenway to Dorchester.
It is.
I mean, that's crazy.
And if you park at Alewife, you might have something fall on your head when you get out of
You
your
might have
car.
something fall on your head, but you'll pay extra for it.
You will. That's a terrible thing as well.
Yes, we fought pretty hard for that. Didn't get very far, but we're watching. If the amount of people that use it goes down because of the cost, then we'll be right back to MBTA and say, why are you doing this?
Where might that money come from?
Well, I think I'm very sorry that the Fair Share Amendment was struck down. I think that would have been a great way to get money. I think it's okay to ask people that make over $1 million to pay a little more than, percentage-wise than somebody who makes $50,000 or right.
So it was an increased tax on people whose W-2 income is over $1 million.
So I think that was a smart way to raise the money. I think now we have to go back and start the process again, unfortunately, because I think that was a fair way. And, people got really upset with Jay Gonzalez when he talked about having a tax on endowments and nonprofits over $1 billion, colleges over $1 billion.
Right.
I don't think it's such a crazy idea. I mean, I think we need to look at it, and I think our universities play a very, very important role in our state and in our economy. I'm not sure the forefathers had in mind when they made it nonprofit that it would be quite to this extent.
Some of those universities are just so wealthy. I mean,
Really,
Harvard comes to mind immediately.
Yeah. Yeah, and they have a lot of real estate, and they don't pay taxes on that. And there is a program of payment in lieu of taxes, but very few of the universities actually meet the standard that's been set. So, where can people who are doing, or institutions that rely on what we have here are also part of why we have it? I don't doubt that, but where can we come together and do more for the common good?
We had Jay Kaufman on the show recently, and he thought that it was going to take a constitutional amendment to get the so-called millionaires tax through. Is that your own
No,
view?
that is true.
Yeah.
Because it's in the Constitution about a flat rate, and so that's why the Fair Share Amendment had to go through what it went through, because it is a change. It's a constitutional change.
I see.
That's a fact.
So it's a constitutional change that was prevented by a court ruling.
Because the court viewed it as, so you can never direct a legislature how to spend their money because legislatures change. So this had in it that it would be used for education and transportation. And I thought they changed the language so that it said the intent is, or something. It wasn't quite a directive, but the Supreme Court said you can't do that.
Oh, so that was the real problem, from the court's point of view.
The court's point of view was that the ballot question was flawed.
I see.
That's what happens. You get a ballot initiative, you get a number of signatures, you put you give the ballot to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General says, yes, this passes muster, no, this doesn't. But they're basing it on laws and Constitution when they're looking at it. And one of the things said is that you can't direct a future legislature, on how to spend money. So I think that was the issue with the Fair Share Amendment.
Okay. So it's likely there's likely to be another attempt.
I don't know what the proponents are doing. I hope they are, but it's clearly a multi-year process. It could be even 4 years, but I'm not sure about that.
Okay. So your district includes not only much of Lexington, but Arlington and Woburn and Billerica and Burlington.
Yes.
And how do those communities differ, and how does your work on behalf of them differ, or is it all the same somehow?
Well, on a certain level, it's all the same.
Mm-hmm.
People need help negotiating their government, and in that way, town managers and mayors and select people and boards, we work with them as legislators to help move home rule petitions along, or talk to people to get an understanding of something that's happening, and that's the same, and they're very similar in, they care about their schools and they care about their roads, and so it's all sort of basically the same. They have different characteristics, and they have different kind of ways of going about doing things, and that's very different. Each town has their own unique personality.
Right.
And some towns I hear more from than others. Some towns they're more interested in kind of local issues and me being involved in a local issue to the extent that it's appropriate. Other towns are really interested in issues. Arlington and Lexington are very issue-oriented. They really get down into the weeds of issues. They care about issues. They talk about issues. Whereas other towns are more, they focus on things that are happening there that they want to know that you're paying attention, more so than maybe another town. Mm-hmm. So they're all different, but they all, if you want to talk about roads and schools and other kind of municipal matters, they all want to talk about talk about it. So
I'm sure.
Yeah.
And a lot of areas in all those towns, the roads need work.
Oh yeah. Well, listen, MassDOT is like, will you call MassDOT? Will you call Mass?
Yeah.
MassDOT is actually quite good at a lot of things. They're not the best at communicating, but they have a lot of people who know what they're doing, but they're hard sometimes to connect with. So I spend a certain amount of my time being the go-between between MassDOT and the towns. And roads are important. They're really important.
Well, they are, yeah. And we're just finishing up a nice repaving of a big chunk of Mass Ave here in Lexington that turned out really nicely.
Yeah.
Big improvement.
It is a big improvement. I don't like the lights, but it's a big improvement.
Yeah, it was a very controversial thing.
I know.
Some people said, well, when the town was founded, there weren't any traffic lights.
Well, I sort of scoffed at that when I heard it, and now I was driving down the street the other day thinking, those people were right.
That's good. All right.
But no, it is good. It's much cleaner and
a little safer too in a couple spots.
Definitely.
I think.
Well, Maple Street, that turnout was that was challenging.
It was.
Yeah.
It was. You could wait a very long
You
time
wait
to
a
get
very
off
long-
Maple Street
yeah.
onto Mass Ave. sometimes.
I would like them to turn the lights off at certain times.
Uh-huh.
You know, if you're coming home from Lexington and Arlington and it's 11 o'clock at night or 11:30, you don't need those lights. You know, you don't, because
That's a good
there's
point.
nothing is happening. But
I hadn't noticed. Do they go to just sort of flashing yellow and flashing
no.
red?
Well,
Oh.
at least when I came back
Oh.
from an event and I came, from Lexington and
Yeah.
I waited at the Maple Street. There was
Yeah.
nobody there, and I thought, wow,
Why am I sitting
why
here?
am I sitting here? But I did. So,
Well, we're at about a half an hour here. I'd be happy to wrap up or continue talking a little longer if you'd like to.
it's up to you if you have something else you want to talk about, or
Let's continue a little longer. I know you're not feeling well though, and I don't want to impose. I understand that you, before you went into politics, you were both a teacher and worked in the tech sector.
Mhm.
Is that correct?
yeah.
What was your experience in those jobs, in those roles?
I was a teacher for 5 years.
Mhm.
It's the hardest job I've ever done.
Mm.
It is an awesome responsibility. I was a great teacher for some kids, and I wasn't so great for others. And
What ages were the kids?
so I started out at first where I was in a developmentally disabled kids, because I got a master's in special ed.
Mm.
And then I taught kindergarten through third at different points. And it's both exhilarating and very lonely for me, because you're in a classroom with kids all the time. And I really started to think about what I was good at. And I just feel like teaching is so important that if you're not great at it, and it's lonely because you don't have mentors and people, and this was many years ago, I think it's better now, but that kind of connection with other people on working together and figuring how to do something better was not really part of anything when I was a teacher. So I left teaching, and I went into high tech at a time when high tech was so new and so open that they weren't looking for people who had specific experience because they couldn't, because it didn't exist.
Things are just being invented.
It was being invented. There was barely a computer science degree, I think. And I happened to talk to some people, and those people in turn said, hey, why don't you come look at this job? And I went and looked at the job, and then I spent the next 20 years in high tech. And it was really interesting. I became a manager and a director and managed software and hardware groups. I was an engineer. And it was interesting, and it never won my heart. And it kind of got to a point where I was realizing that I was working very hard and I wasn't getting much fulfillment out of it. So I decided that I needed to leave and sort of figure out what I wanted to do. And I've always been involved in politics and community issues and events, and so I had more time to get involved in politics. As a volunteer, I managed a number of campaigns and that kind of things, and then fell into this job with Ken Donnelly. So they're very different. I feel a lot. I feel like I gained a lot by having those experiences. I think it's made me a much better senator, because I have a sense of how other parts of the world work, which I can
important
bring.
parts.
Yeah,
Yeah, truly
yeah.
important parts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would literally throttle anybody if I ever hear them say, those who can't teach. It is the most offensive statement I can think of, because there is nothing harder
Yeah. Yeah, and so much rides on it.
And so much rides on it.
Our future, essentially, as children grow, and teachers deal with, at least in some places, certainly being underpaid, and probably having to hear a lot from people, including politicians, who believe they have wonderful ideas about how education could be
Right.
made better. Some of which I'm sure are better than others. So it's sort of a public job where people have a lot of ideas about what you do, and it's a very hard job.
Yeah. And I think what we are expecting to be the responsibility of our schools and our teachers is really getting kind of untenable. They can't be the teacher and the social worker and the parent and the healthcare provider, and yet we're doing more and more in our schools with less and less help. We're sort of demanding more and more of people around issues of socioeconomic health, which we all need to be dealing with, not just our schools. And I understand the drive to have schools be part of that and partner to some of those solutions, but they can't be just the providers. It's like asking our policemen to be social workers.
Right.
It's just, that's not what they're trained to do, and you can't minimize what a social worker does. You can't minimize what a teacher does when they're a really good teacher. So it's, or a policeman when they're a good policeman. There's partnerships. We can all work together. We can, the model, for instance, in the police of the social worker driving in the car with the policeman, I think is just a superb model, because the person who really has the expertise is there. The policeman can do his job or her job of protecting them, and they can learn how to de-escalate or what makes sense, and they work together and they create this partnership, so they're stronger. And I think it's the same in schools, but we need trained people whose job it is to figure out the emotional, well-being of a child, to work with our schools and our teachers to handle more and more of the issues that come before them. I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, it does. It makes perfect sense. And I imagine you're talking about positions like school psychologists and school counselors.
Like school counselors, school guidance counselors, the nutrition people, the after school, longer days. I mean, Are you in favor of a longer school day? Well, I'm certainly, in Lexington, probably 99% of the kids have a longer school day because they do other things.
Right.
But when you get into other communities, that's not the case, and
Right.
they need that support. And if it's instruction, then the teacher should provide it. If it's care, then that needs to happen with people who can do those jobs. So I think we like to do, we don't like to spend the money, but we like to have people do things. It's that same.
We do.
I don't want to pay for it, but make this better. No.
So is that, I imagine, at least in some sections of your, of the fourth Middlesex, there are disparities between educational experiences and such, and
in economic.
In economics.
Financial. And, it's very different.
In Lexington, I think, my kids went through the school system. I have some experience of it. I think especially at the high school level, sometimes the high school, which is very well rated, very well respected, is even then just sort of the center of a high school student's experience, and it's supplemented by all sorts of other activities and classes and mentorships and internships. And you might not see that as much in other parts of your own district. And what in the long run, in the big picture, what might be done to even some of that out, do you think?
Well, partly you have to respect the community and what the community values are.
Sure.
So as long as the community is able to kind of decide what it is they want and how they want to raise their children, with a baseline, you
Sure.
know, then it's up to the community.
Okay.
And that's valid. So I think that we need to allow that, but I think there's got to be certain baseline in that we follow. And when, I mean, I think the notion of the state has of trying to help the underperforming schools is a good one. It makes sense. It's just how you do that and how long you do it and what kind of resources you're giving to people while you're expecting them to raise the level of education or the success or outcomes of the kids. So it really is looking at that and knowing that, again, how are we spending our money and are we doing it in the most efficient way? And, you know, we've been trying to change the education formula that has been around for now, I don't know, it's been at least, I think it's 30 years since it's been changed, or maybe 20. But it's a very different world now, and the cost of educating kids has to be determined in a different way than it used to be. And we've got to make that change, right? So we can say, well, this is actually how much it costs to educate a child. Now in Lexington, that's not as big an issue because there's such a community commitment to education.
Right.
And they have, and Lexington has the means to be able to supplement that. But you go to Holyoke and Boston and Springfield, they don't, and Lawrence, they don't. It's not they don't want to, it's that they can't. So it's part of our job to make sure there's some balance there. And it, you know, I don't like to say that because, you know, I know there's people in my district who want me to just fight for what's in, you know, getting funding from my district, but I can't do that in a complete vacuum because we're a commonwealth. Right. And our ability to maintain stability and to be economically vibrant means that the whole state has to be successful. It can't be just tiny pockets. It's got to be, you know, everyone has to have access. So that's what I fight for because I think fundamentally it's good for all of us.
And there's something, when you look at the disparity between a couple of the towns in your district and places that really haven't done as well, like Lawrence, Holyoke, there's a sort of a social justice aspect to it. You know, how can we have our kids have it so good here and have other people's kids not have it as good over here without working towards making it better? But school systems are primarily funded by local property taxes?
Yes. There's a formula. Chapter 70 is the chapter of the Mass General Laws, and it comes up with a formula for what it costs to educate a child, and then there's a formula that says what percentage the state, you know, what are you able, and then it looks at what you're able to pay as a community based on your property values and your income for that community, and then they determine, that's determined by a formula, and then they decide what the difference is between what you can raise and what you and what it costs to educate that child. That's really simplistic, but that's basically how it works. And then the state gives money based on what the difference is in your ability to pay and what it costs to educate a child. So places like Lexington, because there's high property rates and high income, they get a minimum of 17% or 17.5% of what the state says it costs to educate that child. Now, Lexington spends a lot more money than the state says, and they have a really good school system. Lexington is also lucky because it has a decent commercial base. Right. So they get commercial tax from that. Woburn has a really good commercial base.
They do.
Burlington has a phenomenal commercial base.
Right.
Billerica's commercial base is growing enormously. They have lots of high tech moving in, helps them. Arlington has virtually no commercial base, so the effect on their schools and their money, their funding, is much more intense than it is in the rest of my district, because they don't have a commercial base to feed in to raise those taxes to fund the school. So it's very much on the property tax.
Oh, I see. So the plethora of retail establishments and restaurants doesn't amount to a real commercial base.
So it's about 5%
okay.
of the town. The rest of the income, the rest of the tax base is residential.
Oh,
That's very, and we don't have room to expand.
Right.
It's not like there's like we don't have a lot of open, we have no open space in Arlington, so there's one parcel left.
Yeah.
So, it's not, it's a difficult system. It's one, it's like any system, it kind of works generally for a bunch of people, but there's a fairly good size group of people, a minority, but a good size that it doesn't work for. So we have to figure out that, how we do that. And if we can free up some of our healthcare dollars, we'd have more money.
That's a good point. So the recent election gave us Governor Baker again. Jay Gonzalez did not win. What is your view of Governor Baker, and do you have interactions with him? How does your job affect, and how is it affected by the governor?
Well, it's affected by the governor in that the governor manages the executive branch, and the executive branch has a lot of power in its regulatory authority and what it pushes and what it doesn't push, and they also have a bully pulpit, around issues. So I interact with Health and Human Services because of my chairmanship quite a bit. So I have relationships with them. I have relationships with the Department of Insurance, because those are the people that we interact with, not only when we have issues, but also as we're developing legislation. Those are the people that are often the ones that are going to implement it. So it's really important to have relationships with those people and be able to discuss legislation and where they are, what their issues are, what they feel comfortable, what they don't feel comfortable. If you can do that, you have a much stronger bill. You have more people that will, get on board to implement it. So my interactions with Health and Human Services, I have to say, have been good around the opioid piece.
The opioid piece, which is a tremendous problem.
Yep.
And overall, how do you think that Governor Baker and his work has affected your district and what goes on there, and what you would like for it? Has he been a beneficial governor?
I think the biggest issue for me is the issue of transportation and the MBTA. And I think that the executive office is shortchanging the MBTA. I think they're not being honest about what we need to run an efficient system, and that really affects my district a lot. I mean, that's a big effect. And the willingness to ask to spend money on expanding that system as well, so that more people have access to it, it's more efficient, more dependable, and it stays at a price that people can afford. So I think that's a big effect that some of the policies of the administration has on my district. And then I think the issue of housing, but that's more nuanced, I think.
How so?
Well, I think the legislature has a lot to say about housing, and I'm not sure if the governor were here right now what I would ask him to do about housing.
Okay,
So
fair enough. And we touched on housing earlier, and we were talking earlier about how expensive this area is. But I'm not sure we necessarily got to what some solutions might be, unless I've forgotten already, which is possible.
Well, I think a big solution is transportation, is address the transportation
Okay.
problem.
Yes,
so that people
we
have
talked
more
about
access.
If there were a good train to Springfield, people could live out there.
People could live out there if
and
they're,
ride
you
in.
know, if we could have dedicated bus lanes for people from the city and, you know, out to 128, we could get rid of some of our congestion. It would allow more people to get to places easier.
Yeah.
And I think transportation is a big issue. And, you know, not to say nothing of its environmental impacts.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we live in Lexington, not too far away, as is true of anyone in town, from the Burlington Mall, another town that's in your district.
Yeah.
Malls, in some places, are kind of falling on hard times,
Yeah.
and they're cutting back and closing. And do you know anything about what's happening there in that regard?
What I know about the Burlington Mall is the issue that they have is workforce.
Oh,
And workforce is very much an effect of transportation.
oh,
Because people don't have transportation to get back and forth. Lawrence to Burlington would be a very popular route.
Yeah.
Because people could come from Lawrence, work in the malls, go back, you know. And so there's a lot of effort in the district to try and figure out how we get more transportation into places like the mall so that people can not only work but come and shop and use the, you know, the amenities there. So that's a big issue, but it's a big workforce issue. You know, how do you get the workforce to the place where there are jobs? And a lot of people who work in this industry don't necessarily have cars, or we don't want them to have. We don't want them to drive. So transportation is a major, major issue for the mall. They seem to be doing really well. I haven't heard that, you know. I mean, that whole part of Burlington is just
it's being more and more developed all the
unrecognizable.
time. Yeah. New stores, new restaurants all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really something. I remember when that mall was just one level when I was a kid, and then it grew and it grew and it grew.
Yeah.
But maybe this is why companies like Uber have taken off in such a big way. Transportation is lacking in other ways.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you used Uber, right, it's pretty nice.
I might have used it once, but my son uses it all the time, everywhere he goes.
So it turns out it's a big problem. Turns out it's adding many, many, many more cars to the road.
Yeah, more than 100,000 trips a day in Boston, I read.
Yeah. It was like to the airport. I mean, and it's like, so it's a great service that's causing an enormous amount of problems. So what do we do about it? These are big problems.
Right.
I don't pretend to have all the answers.
Oh, it's okay. I doubt anyone does.
So.
Anything else? We've got about 5 minutes left. Anything else of interest to you that we didn't get to yet?
Well, I just want people to know that I have office hours in Lexington every month, and that you can go into my website and find out when they are. Or you can call my office, 617-722-1432, and set up an appointment to talk with me. I'm happy to talk with any residents about any issues or thoughts they have, and I'd love to see people. And I'm really, really, really sad that Jay Kaufman is leaving. He's a dear friend and a phenomenal legislator, and I'm excited to work with Michelle.
They're both wonderful people. When we had Jay on, it was a couple of weeks ago, it was actually the first time I'd met him, and when the show was over, I thought, it's a real loss.
Yeah.
This guy's wonderful.
Yeah.
But at the same time, Michelle has been on too, and she's also wonderful.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think Jay is going to continue to give her a bit of advice here and there.
That's great for her. And
Yeah.
we don't want to lose them. So.
Where are your office hours in Lexington?
So right now they're at the senior center, and sometimes we move around and have them at like Panera or Pete's. Or I know that I'm having a joint office hours with Michelle, I think in December.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure of the exact date. I think it's early December. And I think that's going to be a Panera, but I'm not sure, so I should... See, these are the kind of things I'm supposed to know. But
Well, I bet you have someone who helps you keep
I
track of
have
these
somebody,
things.
thank God, and they're very, very good at it, much better than I.
When I talked to the folks at your office a couple of times, I was impressed with how good they were.
Yes.
They were on top of everything.
Well, they are a phenomenal group of people, and I could absolutely not do this job in any way, shape, or form without them.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. I know you're not feeling well today, but you came on nonetheless, and I learned a lot speaking with you. I appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thanks. It was great to meet you.
Thank you. Maybe we can have you back at some point.
Sure.
You've been watching In Conversation. We've been talking to Senator Cindy Friedman. Thanks for watching.